Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the thing you've been desperately chasing your entire life, approval, success, love, recognition, suddenly doesn't matter anymore. Not because you've given up, but because you've stumbled upon something far more powerful. The realization that your obsession with these things was the very prison keeping you trapped. This isn't apathy. This isn't depression. This is something Michel de Montaigne discovered in his Tower Library 5 centuries ago, something so counterintuitive that it challenges everything our achievement-obsessed culture teaches us about happiness and fulfillment. Picture this. You're at a party, desperately trying to impress everyone around you. You monitor every word, every gesture, every laugh. You're performing, not living. Your heart races with anxiety. You leave exhausted, feeling like you failed some invisible test. Now imagine walking into that same party completely indifferent to what anyone thinks of you. You speak your truth. You laugh genuinely. You connect authentically. You leave energized, having actually enjoyed yourself. What changed? You stopped caring about the outcome. But here's what makes this revelation terrifying. We've been conditioned to believe that caring intensely about everything is what makes us human, what drives us forward, what separates us from animals. We've been told that passion and ambition are virtues, that not caring is the path to mediocrity and failure. What if everything we've been told is backwards? What if the very act of desperately wanting something is what repels it from us? What if our attachment to outcomes is the invisible force sabotaging our happiness, our relationships, our peace of mind? What if the secret to getting what you want is to stop wanting it so desperately? This paradox has haunted philosophers for millennia, but Montaigne was the first to live it fully and document the transformation. He discovered that when you release your death grip on life, life finally has room to surprise you. When you stop trying to control every variable, variables start aligning in your favor. Think about your own experience. When did you perform your best? Was it when you were consumed with anxiety about the outcome? Or when you were so absorbed in the process that you forgot about winning or losing? When did you attract the most genuine connections? When you were desperately trying to be liked, or when you were simply being yourself, indifferent to others' opinions? The most attractive people aren't those who try hardest to be attractive. The most successful people aren't those who are most afraid of failure. The happiest people aren't those who chase happiness most relentlessly. There's a secret operating principle in human psychology that Montaigne uncovered. The more desperately you want something, the more your desperation corrupts your ability to achieve it. Your neediness becomes a repellent force. Your anxiety becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your attachment becomes a chain that keeps you from the very freedom you seek. But this creates a maddening puzzle. How do you achieve goals without caring about achieving them? How do you build relationships without needing validation? How do you create meaning without becoming attached to specific outcomes? How do you live fully while remaining indifferent to life's rewards and punishments? Most people spend their entire lives trapped in this contradiction, swinging between desperate effort and bitter disappointment, never understanding why their hardest efforts often yield their poorest results. Montaigne found the answer by accident. He retreated to his tower not to find enlightenment, but to escape the political chaos of his time. What he discovered there would revolutionize not just his own life, but our understanding of human psychology itself. Before we dive deeper into his revolutionary insight, I want you to do something for me. If this idea is already challenging your assumptions about success and happiness, if you're feeling that mixture of curiosity and resistance that comes when someone threatens your fundamental beliefs about how life works, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what we're about to explore will either transform how you approach every aspect of your life, or it will confirm that you're not ready for this level of psychological freedom. The question that will guide us through this exploration is not whether Montaigne's philosophy is correct, but whether you're brave enough to test it in your own life. Because once you understand what he discovered in that tower, you can never go back to the desperate, attachment-driven way of living that keeps most people perpetually frustrated and unfulfilled. Are you ready to discover why everything you've been taught about caring, trying harder, and never giving up might be the very thing keeping you from the life you actually want. The problem runs deeper than you think. What we call caring is actually a sophisticated form of psychological imprisonment that begins in childhood and strengthens with every disappointment, every rejection, every moment we learn that our worth depends on external validation. Carl Jung identified this as the fundamental neurosis of modern civilization. We've confused our authentic self with our adaptive self, the version of us that learned to perform for love, approval, and survival. When you care intensely about an outcome, you're not expressing your true desires. You're expressing your wounds, your fears, your desperate need to prove that you're worthy of existing. Michel de Montaigne understood this 5 centuries before Jung. In his essay on the inconsistency of our actions, he wrote about discovering that most of his intense desires weren't actually his own. They were inherited from society, from his education, from the accumulated expectations of everyone who had ever held power over him. He realized that what felt like passionate caring was actually compulsive reactivity to psychological programming he had never consciously chosen. Consider the anatomy of attachment. You want something desperately because you believe getting it will change how you feel about yourself. You want the promotion because you think it will make you feel valuable. You want the relationship because you think it will make you feel lovable. You want the recognition because you think it will make you feel significant. But here's what Montaigne discovered that modern psychology has confirmed. External achievements can never heal internal wounds. They can only temporarily distract you from them. The person who gets the promotion but still feels inadequate will simply need a bigger promotion. The person who finds love but still feels unlovable will become obsessively jealous or clingy. The desperation never ends because you're trying to solve an inside problem with outside solutions. Arthur Schopenhauer later formalized this insight in his concept of the will to live, the blind, insatiable force that drives all human suffering. According to Schopenhauer, most of what we call desire is actually this unconscious will, using us as instruments for its own perpetuation. We think we want things for ourselves, but we're actually being driven by forces we don't understand toward goals that can never satisfy us. Montaigne's breakthrough was recognizing that this cycle could be broken through a radical shift in perspective. Instead of trying to satisfy the will, you could observe it. Instead of being driven by your desires, you could study them with curiosity. Instead of identifying with your attachments, you could watch them like weather patterns in your consciousness. This wasn't mere intellectual understanding. Montaigne practiced what he called the art of living experimentally. He would deliberately place himself in situations where his attachments were triggered, then observe how his mind created stories, how his body created sensations, how his ego created drama around these temporary experiences. What he discovered was shocking. The intensity of his caring was directly proportional to his unconsciousness about why he was caring. The more aware he became of his psychological patterns, the more his desperate attachments dissolved into simple preferences. He still had goals, but they no longer owned him. He still formed relationships, but he no longer needed them to complete him. Jean-Paul Sartre would later call this phenomenon bad faith, the unconscious agreement to let external circumstances define your internal reality. When you care desperately about something, you're essentially saying, "My emotional state is at the mercy of this outcome. If I don't get what I want, I will suffer. If I do get it, I will be happy." You've handed your psychological sovereignty over to forces beyond your control, but there's an even deeper layer to this problem that most people never recognize. Desperate caring actually sabotages your ability to achieve what you want. When you need something too badly, you approach it from a position of scarcity and desperation. This energy is repulsive to others and corrupts your decision-making. Think about someone trying too hard to be funny. Their desperation for laughter makes them unfunny. Someone trying too hard to be attractive becomes unattractive. Someone trying too hard to be loved becomes unlovable. The needy energy creates the very outcome they're trying to avoid. Montaigne noticed this pattern everywhere, in politics where the most power-hungry people were least fit to lead, in romance where the most desperate lovers drove away their beloved, in philosophy where the most dogmatic thinkers were furthest from truth. The universe seemed designed to give people what they needed, not what they desperately wanted. This led him to a radical hypothesis. What if attachment itself was the problem? What if the very act of caring intensely about outcomes was a form of psychological violence against reality? What if peace, success, and fulfillment naturally emerged when you stopped trying to force them into existence? But this raised an even more disturbing question. If most of your caring is actually unconscious reactivity to psychological wounds, and if this reactivity sabotages your ability to get what you want, then who are you when you stop caring? What remains when you strip away all the desperate wanting, all the fear-driven striving, all the compulsive need to prove yourself? Montaigne was about to discover that this wasn't a loss. It was the greatest liberation possible. But first, he had to face what he called the great emptiness, the terrifying void that appears when you stop using external achievements to avoid your internal reality. What Montaigne couldn't have known, but what modern neuroscience has confirmed, is that desperate caring literally rewires your brain in ways that make you less capable of achieving what you want. When you're attached to an outcome, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for clear thinking and good decisions, goes offline. Your amygdala takes over, flooding your system with stress hormones that narrow your perception and impair your judgment. This is why you make your worst decisions when the stakes feel highest. It's why you say the wrong thing during important conversations, why you choke during crucial performances, why you sabotage relationships when you want them most. Your desperation activates your threat detection system, which was designed for physical survival, not psychological thriving. But the invisible damage goes far deeper than poor performance. When you live in a state of constant attachment to outcomes, you're essentially training your nervous system to remain in chronic stress. Your body can't distinguish between a saber-toothed tiger and a deadline, between a physical threat and the threat of social rejection. The same biochemical cascade that kept your ancestors alive now keeps you trapped in cycles of anxiety, insomnia, and emotional volatility. Montaigne intuited this mind-body connection centuries before we had scientific language for it. He noticed that his most intense desires were always accompanied by physical tension, shallow breathing, and what he called a kind of fever in the soul. He began to suspect that the caring itself was more painful than not getting what he wanted. Consider how attachment distorts your perception of reality. When you desperately want something, you engage in what psychologists call motivated reasoning. You unconsciously filter information to support your desires while ignoring contradictory evidence. You see signs and synchronicities where none exist. You interpret neutral events as meaningful confirmations. You create elaborate narratives about why things must work out the way you want them to. This cognitive bias doesn't just affect your internal experience. It affects your behavior in ways that push away the very things you're trying to attract. When you need someone's approval too badly, you become hypervigilant to their reactions, analyzing every word and gesture for signs of acceptance or rejection. This intense focus makes you anxious and inauthentic, which makes others uncomfortable around you, which creates the rejection you feared in the first place. Montaigne called this the mirror of desperation, how our neediness gets reflected back to us by everyone we encounter. Desperate people attract other desperate people, creating relationships built on mutual neediness rather than genuine connection. Confident people, sensing the energy of desperation, instinctively withdraw to protect their own peace. The cultural programming makes this worse. We live in a society that profits from your attachments. Every advertisement is designed to make you feel incomplete without their product. Social media algorithms are engineered to trigger your comparison mechanisms, making you feel inadequate, without more likes, followers, or validation. The entire economic system depends on keeping you in a state of perpetual wanting. What Montaigne realized in his tower retreat was that he had been living his entire life according to other people's definitions of success, love, and happiness. He had internalized their values so completely that he couldn't distinguish between his authentic desires and their expectations. When he examined his deepest cravings, He found that most of them belonged to his parents, his teachers, his culture, not to him. This discovery was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If most of his caring was borrowed from others, then who was he beneath all that conditioning? If he stopped trying to meet everyone else's expectations, what would remain? Would he become lazy, selfish, unmotivated? Would he lose his drive for achievement and excellence? These fears keep most people trapped in cycles of attachment, even when they intellectually understand the problem. The ego whispers, if you stop caring so much, you'll become mediocre. If you stop trying so hard, you'll fail. If you stop needing approval, you'll end up alone. But Montaigne discovered something remarkable. The opposite was true. When he released his desperate grip on outcomes, his natural motivation emerged. When he stopped performing for others, his authentic personality became magnetic. When he stopped needing validation, he began attracting genuine admiration. The attachment wasn't fueling his success. It was interfering with it. His desperation wasn't making him try harder. It was making him try dumber. His caring wasn't improving his relationships. It was corrupting them with neediness and manipulation. Modern psychology has a term for this phenomenon: ironic process theory. When you try not to think of a white elephant, you immediately think of a white elephant. When you try too hard to fall asleep, you stay awake. When you try too hard to be confident, you become self-conscious. The very effort to control an outcome often prevents that outcome from occurring naturally. Montaigne began to see attachment as a form of psychological violence, not just against himself, but against reality itself. When you need things to be different than they are, you're essentially arguing with existence. You're saying that your desires are more important than what actually is. This creates a constant state of internal conflict that exhausts your energy and clouds your judgment. The post-insidious consequence of living this way is that you never actually experience the present moment. You're always projecting into an imaginary future where you'll finally be happy once you get what you want, or ruminating about a past where you should have gotten what you wanted. Your life becomes a series of delayed gratifications that never actually gratify because there's always something else to want desperately. But what happens when you stop? What emerges when you release your death grip on outcomes and learn to dance with uncertainty instead of fighting it? Montaigne was about to find out, and what he discovered would change everything. The rebellion begins with a single radical act: choosing to observe your attachments instead of being enslaved by them. Montaigne called this stepping outside yourself to watch yourself, becoming the scientist of your own psychological patterns rather than their victim. Here's how the transformation works. Instead of saying, "I need this job to feel valuable," you say, "I notice that I'm telling myself I need this job to feel valuable. Interesting." Instead of, "I can't live without this relationship," you observe, "I'm having the thought that I can't live without this relationship. How curious that my mind creates such dramatic stories." This shift from identification to observation is the foundation of psychological freedom. You're not suppressing your desires or pretending they don't matter. You're simply refusing to let them hijack your peace of mind. You're creating space between who you are and what you want. Montaigne discovered that this space, what he called the gap of freedom, contained infinite possibilities. When you're not consumed by desperate wanting, you can see options that were invisible before. When you're not driven by fear of loss, you can take calculated risks that attachment would have made impossible. When you're not performing for approval, your authentic charisma emerges naturally. The practice is deceptively simple but profoundly difficult. Every time you notice yourself caring desperately about an outcome, you pause and ask 3 questions that Montaigne developed. What am I really afraid will happen if I don't get this? What do I think getting this will prove about me? Whose approval am I really seeking through this desire? Usually, the answers reveal that your attachment isn't about the thing itself. It's about using that thing to avoid facing something uncomfortable about yourself or your past. The promotion isn't about money. It's about proving to your critical father that you're worthy. The relationship isn't about love. It's about escaping the loneliness you've been avoiding since childhood. The recognition isn't about achievement. It's about healing the wound of feeling invisible. Once you see the real motivation behind your attachment, something magical happens. The attachment begins to loosen naturally. You realize you've been trying to solve old problems with new achievements, trying to heal old wounds with external band-aids. This awareness doesn't eliminate your goals, it purifies them. You can still want the promotion, the relationship, the recognition, but now you want them from a place of creativity rather than compulsion, preference rather than desperation. Montaigne found that this shift had an almost supernatural effect on his results. When he stopped needing people to like him, they were drawn to his authenticity. When he stopped fearing failure, he took bolder risks that led to greater successes. When he stopped trying to control outcomes, outcomes began aligning in his favor. More often, this isn't magical thinking, it's practical psychology. When you're not driven by desperate attachment, you make better decisions. Because your judgment isn't clouded by fear, you communicate more effectively because you're not filtering everything through your needs. You attract better opportunities because your energy isn't contaminated by neediness. But here's the counterintuitive part that most people resist. You have to be genuinely willing to not get what you want. Not as a strategy to get it, but as a sincere acceptance of uncertainty. If you practice non-attachment as a technique to achieve your goals, you're still attached, just more cleverly. True freedom comes only when you're genuinely okay with either outcome. Montaigne tested this principle in every area of his life. In politics, he stopped desperately seeking power and became more influential. In friendship, he stopped needing approval and formed deeper connections. In writing, he stopped caring about fame and created works that outlasted his contemporaries. The pattern was consistent: surrender the desperate need, and the thing often comes naturally. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. Montaigne remained actively engaged with life. He just stopped making his emotional well-being dependent on specific outcomes. He called this passionate indifference, caring deeply about the process while remaining unattached to results. The practical application requires daily practice. Every morning, Montaigne would identify his strongest attachment of the day, usually something he was worried about or excited about, and practice holding it lightly. He would imagine losing it completely and notice what fears or stories arose. He would trace those fears back to their source, usually finding wounded parts of himself that needed compassion rather than external validation. Throughout the day, he would catch himself in moments of desperate caring and pause to breathe space around the attachment, not to eliminate it, but to prevent it from eliminating his peace. He developed what he called the art of elegant detachment, remaining fully engaged while internally free. The rebels who master this art become unstoppable, not because they fight harder, but because they fight smarter. They take bigger risks because they're not attached to safety. They love more freely because they're not attached to being loved back. They create more boldly because they're not attached to approval. They live more fully because they're not attached to living forever. But the deepest rebellion isn't against society or other people. It's against the voice in your head that says you need anything external to be complete. That voice has been running your life through fear, and it's time to retire it as your primary advisor. What emerges when you do this successfully isn't emptiness or indifference. It's the most profound aliveness you've ever experienced. Because when you're not using your energy to desperately chase outcomes, all that energy becomes available for pure presence, pure creativity, pure joy in the simple fact of existing. This is where Montaigne's philosophy leads to its most revolutionary conclusion, one that will either liberate you completely or challenge everything you think you know about the nature of happiness itself. The ultimate truth that Montaigne discovered in his tower will seem almost too simple to be revolutionary. You already have everything you need to be completely fulfilled. Not in some future moment when you achieve your goals, not when you finally fix all your problems, not when you become the person you think you should be. Right now, exactly as you are, with whatever you have. This isn't positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. This is the most practical insight possible. The happiness you're chasing through external achievements already exists within you. It's been there all along, buried beneath layers of conditioning that taught you to look everywhere, except where fulfillment actually lives. Montaigne called this revelation the Great Return, the moment you stop seeking yourself in other people's opinions, in future accomplishments, in ideal circumstances, and return to the simple awareness that has been watching all your seeking. That awareness, the one reading these words right now, the one that has been present through every moment of your life, is not lacking anything. It doesn't need to be improved, validated, or completed. It simply is. When you truly understand this, everything changes, not because your external circumstances become perfect, but because you realize they were never the source of your problems or your solutions. The poverty you were running from was imaginary. The wealth you were running toward was always already yours. This is why attachment causes suffering. You're seeking something you already possess in places where it cannot be found. It's like frantically searching for your glasses while they're on your head, or looking for water while you're swimming in an ocean. The seeking itself is what creates the sense of lack. Montaigne tested this realization through what he called the experiment of enough. For 1 month, he practiced being completely satisfied with whatever he had, his current level of health, wealth, recognition, companionship, not resigned or defeated, but genuinely content. He stopped comparing his reality to his fantasies and started experiencing his reality directly. What he discovered was shocking. When he stopped believing he needed more to be happy, he became happier than he had ever been while chasing more. When he stopped thinking his current circumstances were inadequate, he began to notice beauty, meaning and joy that had been invisible while he was focused on what was missing. This wasn't delusion or settling for mediocrity. His standards didn't lower. His appreciation deepened. He still had preferences, still set goals, still worked toward improvements. But his emotional well-being was no longer held hostage by outcomes. He could enjoy the journey without needing to arrive at any particular destination. The deepest layer of this realization is understanding that your essential nature, the awareness that witnesses all your experiences, is inherently free, peaceful, and complete. Every external thing you've ever desired was actually a symbol for qualities that already exist within this awareness. The love you seek is your capacity to love. The peace you want is your natural state beneath mental agitation. The fulfillment you chase is the fullness of pure presence. When you recognize this, your entire relationship with life transforms. You stop being a beggar, asking reality for scraps of happiness, and recognize yourself as the source of what you've been seeking. You stop trying to complete yourself through experiences and start offering your completeness to experiences. This doesn't mean becoming passive or losing your motivation. Instead, your actions become expressions of fullness rather than attempts to fill emptiness. You create not because you need to prove yourself, but because creativity is your nature. You love not because you need to be loved back, but because love is what you are. You pursue goals not because you'll be inadequate without them, but because growth and expression are natural impulses of consciousness. Montaigne found that living from this understanding made him extraordinarily effective in the world. When you're not desperately seeking validation, you can focus completely on contribution. When you're not afraid of failure, you can take risks that lead to breakthrough innovations. When you're not attached to being special, your genuine uniqueness shines through naturally. But perhaps the most profound shift is in how you relate to other people. When you're not using relationships to complete yourself, you can love others for who they are rather than for what they provide. When you're not seeking approval, you can offer authentic presence. When you're not competing for limited resources of attention and affection, you can celebrate others' success as extensions of the same consciousness you recognize in yourself. This is Montaigne's final gift to humanity, the recognition that the separate, needy, attachment-driven self is just a story you've been telling yourself. Beneath that story is something vast, peaceful, and already whole. When you stop identifying with the story and rest as what you actually are, everything you thought you needed to get from the world reveals itself as what you are offering to the world. The ultimate rebellion isn't against authority or society, it's against the belief that you are incomplete. The ultimate freedom isn't getting what you want, it's recognizing that what you truly are lacks nothing. If this resonates with something deep inside you, If you feel the recognition of a truth you've always known but forgotten, then share this insight with someone who might need to remember their own completeness. Leave a comment about your own experiments with attachment and detachment. And remember, you don't need to understand this perfectly to benefit from it. Simply questioning your attachments is already the beginning of liberation. The tower where Montaigne made these discoveries still stands in France. But the real tower is the space of awareness where you can retreat at any moment to remember who you are beneath all your wanting. That tower is always available, and in it you will always find everything you've been seeking everywhere else.